I'd like to talk to you today about what I believe is the greatest evil in the world today. Now, I know many of you that follow what I have to say probably think I'm going to talk to you about Islam. Actually, I believe that God is raising up Islam to punish the Christian nations of the world for this great evil that I'm going to talk about today. And that great evil is banking. Now, you're probably thinking, Charlie, have you gone out of your ever-loving mind? Banking as evil? Yes, please listen for a while and I'll try to make that make sense. But I believe that most of what we see that's wrong with the world today is a result of our banking system. The Bible actually describes our banking system in the book of Revelation. It talks about Mystery Babylon, mother of whores and abominations of the earth. And it goes on to say that all the nations of the earth are made drunk with the wine of her fornication. Now, you know, if you speak out against banking, people try to shut you up. People don't want to hear. Well, why is that? Well, for one thing, banking institutions are the most powerful institutions in most local communities. Most of us, including myself, have friends and family members that work at banks. And I'm not trying to imply that they're bad people or immoral people. What I want to show you today is that the system itself is immoral. Now, I wrote the book, God's Law, the Only Political Solution. And in that book is a chapter entitled God, a Better Than Fair Economist. And I show why I believe our banking system is a violation of God's law. Now, first of all, you know the world's a complicated and confusing place. I know it is. And I've studied this for 35 years probably. And I want to tell you that I know that this is a very complicated issue and hard to get your mind wrapped around. But I'm going to try to make it as simple as possible. I believe that to address the problem issues in our world today, the proper way to address them is to break them down in their most basic elements. And we should look at all issues as moral issues. We should look at things as basic right or wrong. Okay? What's right? Keeping God's commandments is right. What's wrong? Violating God's commandments is wrong. If we as a society violate God's commandments, bad consequences follow. And I want to show you how we are having bad consequences follow as a result of our disobedience of God's law in this area of banking. Now, to understand this mysterious Babylonian whore that the book of Revelation talks about, I'd like to take you back on a trip back through history. And we're going to go back to Babylon, and we're going to examine how the Babylonian grain banker did business. In Babylon, they grew wheat around that area. It was the most important thing they had because it was their basic food source. Wheat was also the money or medium of exchange. If you wanted to buy, say, a pair of shoes, you'd take the appropriate amount of wheat to the shoemaker and trade that for a pair of shoes. Well, in Babylon, there was a grain bank, and the grain banker operated the grain bank. And if you deposited your wheat in the grain bank, he would issue you a CD, a certificate of deposit, a receipt for the wheat. Well, now, over time, the tendency developed that when people wanted to spend their grain, rather than take the receipt back to the grain banker, get their wheat out and spend their wheat, they simply spent the receipt. And the grain banker's receipts circulated within the Babylonian economy as if they were money. Now remember, the money or medium of exchange was not the receipts, it was the grain. But the receipts began to circulate as if they were the money. Now at times the Babylonian grain banker would take his own grain and he'd loan it out at interest. Say somebody needed grain to plant for the next harvest. So he'd loan 1 bushel of grain and say, okay, you return 1 bushel plus 10% more, say, as interest for the grain that I've loaned you. At times, people would even borrow grain to use, not as seed for planting or as food to eat, but to borrow it to use as money, since grain was the money. Well, one day somebody came to the Babylonian grain banker to borrow some grain. And he said, you know, I don't really need this grain to plant. I'm not planning on eating the grain. I want to spend it. So really, rather than giving me the grain to go spend, could you just give me one of your receipts for the grain to spend? Well, the grain banker looked in his grain stores and he didn't have any. All of his grain was already loaned out at interest. But he looked into his grain bank and he saw all this other grain that other people had deposited for safekeeping. And he thought, you know, that grain just sits there. People continually spend my receipts. Who would know if I had more receipts outstanding than I had grain? So what he did was he sat down and he issued a receipt for grain that already had a receipt issued for it. Now, historians, monetary historians, are all in agreement that that was the birth of what we call today fractional reserve banking. Now, I want you to think about this Babylonian grain banker. Is what he did a violation of any of God's commands? Well, first of all, he made a promise. That receipt was a promise that he would redeem that receipt for grain. Now, if he had issued more receipts for grain than he had grain, was that a valid promise, or was he a liar? He had broken the command, thou shalt not bear false witness, by issuing 2 receipts for 1 unit of grain. Now, did he break any other of God's laws? Well, I would argue that he broke the law against stealing, because every time he issued a new receipt into existence, loaned it into existence as a unit of debt, he created more money or medium of exchange. And what he did when he did that was he diluted the value of all the other units of exchange or money that was out there in the marketplace. He was creating inflation. What is inflation? Inflation is when the money supply inflates or gets bigger and the value of the money declines. Well, now what happens if the Babylonian grain banker issues, say, 5 receipts for every unit of grain that he's got? Well, as long as not everybody that holds those receipts goes back to redeem them at the same time, he's just fine. And he can earn interest off something he created out of nothing. And that is exactly how our banking system works today. It's known as fractional reserve banking. And bankers, when they make a loan, create new money and loan it into existence, just as the Babylonian grain banker did. Now, the Federal Reserve Bank, which is owned by member commercial banks, it's not a government entity at all, creates money out of nothing and loans it to the federal government. And then that money is used as the basis for commercial banks creating money as loans. That money is then deposited in the commercial banks, It is used as the fractional reserve. Think of it as the grain reserve that the Babylonian grain banker had. And if the reserve ratio is, say, 1 to 5, for every unit of Federal Reserve notes that are deposited in that bank can create 5 times as much money and loan it into existence. Well, you might ask, well, why doesn't the money supply just explode? Well, actually, it is growing rather rapidly. And you might ask yourself, why is the money supply growing? And that's the answer, okay? Why isn't it just absolutely exploding? Now, I want you to think about this. If you went to the Babylonian grain banker and he issued you a receipt and loaned it into existence as a debt accounting entry, okay, when you went to pay him back, there's 2 ways that you could pay him back. You could either pay him back in grain, and if you do that, he has more reserves to make more loans on, or through trade, you could pay him back in his own receipts. Now, if you paid him back in his own receipts, what are those worth to him? Nothing. What does he do with those? He tears them up and throws them away. When you pay the commercial bank the loan in receipts from commercial banks, what happens to those? Those are destroyed. They go out of existence. But think about this. Off of money created out of nothing at no expense, either when the federal government loans to when the Federal Reserve loans to the federal government, or when the commercial banks loan to the people, the banks at both of those levels earn interest on that money. So even though it's destroyed when it's paid back, they have earned interest on something that cost them nothing to create. Now, all money in existence is created at one of those 2 levels, either when the federal government loans, when the Federal Reserve loans to the federal government, or when the commercial banks loan to the people. Now, because of that, there is a fatal flaw in our money system. All money is created out of nothing and loaned into existence. All money must be paid back to the money creator plus interest. How do you pay the only money creator more money than he has created? The answer to that is very simple. You can't. You can't pay more money back than has been created. All that can happen is that the banking system has to create more new money and loan it into existence. So the money supply must always expand. So we must always have inflation. Our money must constantly be decreasing in value. Now, I'm 65 years old. I can remember paying 18 cents a gallon for gasoline. Has the price of gasoline gone up? I would argue it has not. The value of the dollar has gone down. I can remember as a kid, a fudge sickle was a nickel. I just bought one the other day and it was $1.85. So has the price of fudge sickles gone up? No, the value of the dollar has gone up. As a matter of fact, since the Federal Reserve was formed in 1913 to give our money stability, that was the argument, our money has lost over 90% of its value. So our money supply is not stable. And I tell people that the dollar is headed for 0 value. Now, when will it get there? I don't know. But in 100 years, it's lost 90% of its value. And that is an accelerating process. The dollar is losing value quicker now than it has in the past. And that process will, based on historical precedent, accelerate. Now, all the nations of the world have banking systems similar to ours. And that banking system is a house of cards ready to collapse. At some point, it will collapse. In my book, God's Law, the Only Political Solution, in the chapter titled God, a Better Than Fair Economist, I explain this whole system in great detail and give many quotes from famous people about the banking system. I would suggest that you read that.